Hi, I'm Pastor Dave Denoon, and on June 25th, 2022, we finally said goodbye to our friend Bob McCoy. And unfortunately, because of the constraints of time, I was not able to offer the homily that I was expecting to do. What I told the family is that this is one of the longest, if not the longest, homily that I've ever written about any member of a congregation that I've been the pastor of. And they said that they wanted to be able to hear the full sermon rather than just the brief sort of excerpt that I did. If you want to see that, you can watch that video in our live stream selections. Again, that was June 25th, 2022. So this is what I was planning to say. Robert Burchard McCoy, Bob McCoy, is someone about whom it will always be difficult for me to refer to in the past tense. There are a multitude of objects throughout this building which say that he will always be here. Crosses, and the Bible stand on the altar, and the box in which we place taper candles on our Day of Remembrance in November, and Tasmanian devil plush toys and wooden toys and this thing he gave my daughter when we first arrived, which I thought was a zip gun, but turned out to be, thank heaven, a paper airplane launcher. Oh, there's also a handcrafted Bible library for teaching kids about the books and the sections of the Bible. That last item begs the question, why are there extra books on the shelves? He was also quite the gardener, and has assured me that those boxwood branches from the shrubs he propagated himself and gave to me will indeed eventually sprout roots if I just leave them in the damp soil long enough. Those boxwoods outside Memorial Hall are also from him, and any volunteer marigolds you might find there. His spirit, it seems, will always be with us. Bob and I grew up in similar traditions in the same place, Indiana. He came to faith in the Evangelical United Brethren Church, which merged in 1968 with my own Methodist Episcopal Church to form the United Methodist Church. He was from northern Indiana, I was from southern Indiana, my family was from central and southern Indiana, and both of us eventually migrated into the congregational branch of the United Church of Christ. He was actually a leader in the Indiana Congregational Conference's Pilgrim Youth Fellowship in the 1940s, just after the leaders of the Congregationalists and the Evangelical and Reformed Synod signed an agreement to proceed towards a merger which would eventually become the United Church of Christ. And I know you didn't come here for a history lesson, but it's all of a piece with what I want to say to you about Bob. And he did die at age 94. So the stuff that took place when he was a youth to us will just sound like history. So bear with me here, okay? 17-year-old Bob was touring with some other delegates, informing Hoosier Congregationalists about the agreement when he was asked what he personally thought of the agreement. Bob answered honestly with a full-throated endorsement. And afterward, one of the adult leaders he was traveling with told him that this was an inappropriate response to the question, even though the response was truthful. They were on an informational tour, the other delegate reminded him. Bob was obligated to reply with equanimity in order to accurately present the matter, neither endorsing nor rejecting it. Well, this was one of Bob's critical stories about his involvement with the church. There was another he would tell about his father, William McCoy's departure from the EUB to the Congregational Church because the EUB at first ordained him for service as a chaplain in the First World War, and then, afterward, rescinded the ordination, thus preventing Bill McCoy from serving as a pastor. Bill saw this as betrayal of the worst order. You see, Bill had come to Christ unexpectedly in his youth when, armed with eggs and tomatoes, he had attended an EUB revival with the stated purpose of disrupting it. But instead, he'd been so affected by what the preacher said that he walked the aisle himself toward salvation. You don't easily depart from a tradition that introduced you to Jesus. But if they effectively kick you out, then not only you, but your children will recognize the embrace of the tradition in which you find yourself and your ordination accepted. Bill would serve 3 congregational churches as pastor in his lifetime. Bob dearly loved the congregational tradition in which he came of age and the experience of wonder in the wild places, camping especially, where you meet God outside a building and broaden your understanding of creation in communion with its creator. He found himself in the Boy Scouts and eventually would pursue a career with the YMCA, in which he would seek to build community with others centered in values of mutuality and service. His boys and Carol experienced this in the way that he would foster family, traveling, which was both frugal and exotic, to national parks and state parks in the great outdoors. But that bit about equanimity and measured respect of both sides of an issue, not expressing your opinion in leadership, that was never Bob. He could be civil, as was the case in that Pilgrim Fellowship tour, but civility is different than agreement. I saw Bob numerous times seated civilly with others around a table. The Monday morning men, the journeymen. In these groups, he would listen to those who did not necessarily share his opinions about the world or the powers that drive the world or the outcomes they might desire for people in the world, or even sometimes people themselves. But his civility had more to do with his acceptance of others than with any equanimity or balanced assessment of facts. Bob, in the end, like all of us, I think, was an opinionated person, and as in 1948, unabashed about asserting his opinion. Usually he would distract us from the differences we had by introducing some really questionable humor, or some silly puzzle, or a poem, any one of which made the tension you'd been expecting seem insignificant. But once upon a time, interestingly, on my birthday, we hadn't talked about it being my birthday, there was no observance that was going on, but on my birthday in 2017, Bob and I had a moment in which both of us set aside any semblance of civility or humor. I was newly returned from a sabbatical, which had taken my family to Europe and Africa, where I had learned about African Americans who left this country for places where their humanity and dignity were respected, and where their bodies were safe from the prejudice and hate which daily denied them either humanity or dignity here. Outside my office, Bob was telling a patently inappropriate joke to another church member who was saying nothing and who, when the punchline was delivered, must have appeared very uncomfortable. At this reaction, Bob said, "I don't really think that way, you know." I will admit, I called from my desk. "Well, if you don't think that way, then you shouldn't speak that way." He asked me to repeat myself. So I came out of my office, and I confronted him where he stood. What then proceeded between the two of us was a moment of such incivility that Bob stormed out of the office, directly to his car, and drove home. The other church member said to me quietly, "I understand why you did what you just did, but I think you should apologize." I stood there gap-mouthed. Then I swallowed in a dry throat and said, "Yes, I suppose you're right." It took me 2 days to figure out what an apology would sound like. And at the end of those 2 days, I called to see about scheduling a visit. Wasn't even sure he would accept my call. And indeed, Carol answered, saying that Bob was napping. I told her the reason why I was calling, and she said she thought perhaps I had been storing things up with Bob. I said that given his own outburst, he must have been storing things up about me too, and that we did need a meeting of the minds. Bob called about 30 minutes later, civil as ever, and he told me to come over as soon as I was able. which I did. We talked for about 2 hours. We both admitted that we were out of line with the other. Not for failing to be civil. Honestly, civility is overrated. But for failing to affirm that we cannot do without one another, he and I. So we would have to make room for each other. Carol, as she always would when I came to visit, brought us some cookies to share, but otherwise stayed out of the room. It wasn't that she was disinterested, but I am confident that she had witnessed such moments before. Maybe she'd even had such moments with Bob herself, and knew how important it was for Bob and me to deal with one another directly, without a third party in the room either to counsel or to referee. Carol had come to trust Bob, to be able to understand that sometimes, even for all the good and blessed things that he would do, or some not as good things he would do with the best of intentions, he would reach an impasse with someone and could learn himself to trust the other enough to lean into their differences and to find a new way together. Not agree to disagree, but to come to a mutual understanding and affirmation of each other. Our world doesn't do this much. Mostly we agree to disagree and end up polarized and unyielding. We don't learn anything new about the other. We're just civil and mixed company most of the time, but we sit in enemy camps the rest of the time. This was different. Bob was different. I was coming to realize that this business of mutual understanding and affirmation was for Bob what the church is really about. Bob reminded me how when his Robbie died and the family was living in Indianapolis and carloads of members from this church came to the funeral, Bob afterward turned to Carol and said, if we ever get back to St. Louis, no matter where we live, that's our church, and so it would come to pass. I can't tell you how many times he told me that story, but usually it had something to do with the fact that he and I maybe weren't agreeing with each other. This is my church, he would say. This is our church, we would both affirm. That November 1st afternoon, 2 days after my birthday, All Saints' Day, the day after Halloween, as he and I finished talking about everything about each other and the church that drove us crazy and that we held dear, Bob said, I'm glad we had this talk, because this is my church. And even though I may disagree with the things you might say from the pulpit about the world, or disagree about what they say in Cleveland, that's the place where our national church offices are located, this is still my church, and I've got to be in it. Here are the people he has loved, and worked alongside, and embraced, and sat in disbelief that they were saying what they were saying. It hasn't just been me. And maybe Bob experienced this environment as something like family, or extended family anyway, of people you love, you cannot fully understand, but hopefully you can live with, you can trust. There was a moment in the marriage of Bob with Carol, and hear how I say that, of Bob with Carol, when she had to walk away. She never spoke with me about that time, though he did. She only acknowledged that it had happened. Their time apart took more than the 2 days apart that Bob and I needed. He would come to reflect with me that he thought what turned out to be simply a break between the two of them, not a break up, was necessary, that their relationship was better when they came back together again. It was based on a new mutuality and trust that hadn't been there when it was Bob with Carol. Now it could be Bob and Carol. Carol and Bob. Their time apart caused him to consider the importance of her being able to trust him to take her feelings seriously, and to accept that she might want different outcomes than the ones he would imagine for them. In short, he was a better man because she had left and made clear the terms of her return. He was taking her seriously. But aging would be difficult, especially when Carol suffered a stroke and wasn't able to be who she had been before, and her feelings would erupt unexpectedly, and life would be so challenging, especially because all of this had taken place, and then the move, and then COVID. After her death, he would lament that he had sometimes not extended to her the patience that she deserved, or that he simply hadn't been for her the partner he wanted to be. But let's be honest, Bob was getting older too, and I reminded him of this when we would talk, and sometimes life just takes us beyond our limits, and I'd remind him of that. He wondered if she forgave him, he said, for all the times he lost his temper. He wondered if she didn't think she'd made with him the same mistake twice. I assured him that Carol loved him and did forgive him. And she understood about the challenges of aging. And that no, loving him had not been a mistake. He showed me the photo of his dad in the American Legion uniform with Bob in his Navy duds. He took me out onto the patio and showed me where he dreamed of cultivating the marigolds he was trying to sprout and the boxwoods he was planning to plant once he'd gotten some rooted. He complained again that Cape Albion wouldn't allow him to take over 2 adjoining but unused apartments to set up a wood shop so that he and others could feel like they could be useful and meaningful. That was the next to last visit I had with Bob. Talking about Carol, reflecting about his father, planning to plant again. I would visit Bob one more time a few months later, after his friend and frequent provocateur Jim Bennett died. I brought my laptop, let him watch the video of the service, admittedly for the most part through his eyelids, as sitting still in his recliner by that time meant that he was going to nap. When I collected the laptop to go, he assured me that he had just been resting his eyes and that he thought the service was wonderful. And then he reminded me that I didn't have to ask permission ever to pray with him before I left. I should just assume that that would be part of the visit. I can't tell you how many times he said that. And as I prayed, I thanked God for friendship and loving commitment. I prayed for all your well-being, asking for wisdom and a sense of meaning and purpose in all that we do, for mutuality, for trust as individuals, as family, as church. I thanked God for the gift of Jesus, who taught us and teaches us the way and the life, and who leads us in all truth, who makes trust and mutuality truly possible, as well as love that is beyond all other loving. Thanks be to God.